The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. Sarah Chen pushed through the ER entrance at 1947 hours, her badge already in hand, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, blood, probably from the trauma bay, hit her first. 8 months. She'd been at Sacred Heart in San Diego for 8 months, and the hospital had become her refuge in a way she couldn't explain to her sister, couldn't explain to anyone. The night shift suited her. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes watching. Fewer voices asking about the scars on her hands or why she sometimes flinched at drop trays. The cardiac unit occupied the 3rd floor, and she moved through the corridors with a kind of efficiency that came from knowing exactly where everything was and why. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white light of the nursing stations. At 2013 hours, the unit was already humming with the rhythm of admitted patients, 3 post-op, 2 waiting on echo results, 1 stable MI in Bay 6. Sarah checked the assignment board and felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Dr. Marcus Sterling had worked the day shift and left notes. Always notes. 3 pages on a 2-patient handoff. Sterling ran the cardiac unit like a fiefdom. 15 years he'd been here, 15 years building a hierarchy where doctors made decisions and nurses executed them without suggestion, without innovation, without the kind of quiet competence that made people uncomfortable. He had a particular dislike for anyone who questioned protocol or worse, caught his mistakes. Sarah had done both on her 3rd shift at Sacred Heart, and she'd been on his radar ever since. The locker room was empty at this hour. Sarah opened her locker, and there they were, sitting on the bottom shelf exactly where she'd left them that morning. Combat boots. Worn. Broken in across 2 decades of service. The leather was scarred with dust from Ramadi, from the FOB where she'd spent 18 months keeping people alive in spaces between explosions. She didn't touch them. She never touched them during shift. They stayed in the locker like a secret, like proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had existed once, in another life, for another purpose. The person who'd volunteered for 3 consecutive rotations in Helmand Province, who'd run trauma protocols under fire, who'd pulled an 8-year-old boy with a collapsed lung from a building that was still burning, that person had walked away 2 years ago. The PTSD from Ramadi had become a living thing, something that woke her at 0300 with her heart rate climbing for reasons she couldn't name. The nightmares had started before the discharge paperwork was finalized. So she chose this instead. Civilian nursing. Sacred Heart. Night shift in San Diego where nobody knew her name was actually a rank, where nobody asked why her hands were steady enough to draw blood from a 2mm vessel but sometimes trembled in the cafeteria for no reason doctors could find. Her sister didn't know. Nobody knew. The boots stayed in the locker, and Sarah Chen became just another ER nurse with quiet competence and a habit of noticing things other people missed. She finished changing at 20:36 hours. Blue scrubs. Hair tied back. The badge clipped to her pocket. She moved to the cardiac monitoring station where the night charge nurse, Marcus, no relation to Sterling, thank God, was pulling up the patient list. The monitors displayed 5 screens of rhythm strips, a constellation of heartbeats rendered in green light. 2 normal sinus rhythms. 1 atrial fibrillation with a controlled rate. 1 premature ventricular contractions, patterned, every 3rd beat. 1 that made her pause. "Who's in Bay 4?" she asked Marcus. Admission from floor. Post-op day 2 from CABG. Routine neurocheck went fine, but they wanted continuous monitoring overnight. He pulled up the chart. Dr. Sterling wrote the orders. Sarah read the medication list. Metoprolol. Lisinopril. Aspirin. Standard post-operative protocol. But at the bottom, in Sterling's handwriting that slanted toward arrogance, was a new addition, 500 milligrams digoxin 4 daily. She felt the familiar catch in her chest, not fear, not quite. Information. Pain was information. Mistakes were information. "When did he add the digoxin?" she asked. Marcus shrugged. "Sometime this afternoon. Looked fine to me." But it wasn't fine. The patient was already on a beta blocker. The digoxin interactions could push the patient into bradycardia, could slow the heart rate dangerously. And the dose, 500 mg for, was aggressive for a post-op patient, especially one with any renal compromise. Sarah had seen the admission labs. The creatinine was 1.8. Not terrible, but enough to slow drug clearance. Not enough to warrant a 500 mg push. She pulled up Sterling's progress note. 3 sentences. Cardiac function improving, patient tolerating diet, continue current management. Nothing to suggest why he'd added digoxin at all. The monitor in bay showed a heart rate of 48. It had been 62 an hour earlier, according to the flow sheet. It was dropping. Sarah didn't hesitate. She moved to the phone and dialed Sterling's office. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant he'd been waiting for something to annoy him. Dr. Marcus Sterling was the kind of man who collected grievances like other people collected achievements. Tall. Silver-haired. Everything about him designed to suggest he was comfortable in spaces of power. Dr. Sterling, it's Chen. Night shift. I'm calling about your order on Bay 4. Yes? He drew the word out, made it sound like she'd already wasted his time. The digoxin. 500 mg for daily. Patient's creatinine is 1.8 and the heart rate's trending down, 48 last check. That's a significant interaction risk with the metoprolol. She kept her voice level. One measured breath, exactly what the training had taught her. Clear. Factual. Professional. I wanted to flag it before we pushed the first dose. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that meant Sterling was calculating how to respond to a suggestion that something in his judgment might be incomplete. The patient is stable, he said finally. For now. But if we... The order stands, Nurse Chen. Push it as written. I'll be by in the morning. The phone went dead. She held it for another second, then replaced it in the cradle. Marcus looked at her from the other side of the monitoring station, his expression carefully neutral. He pulled the order? Marcus asked. No. She could feel the weight of that one word. No meant that digoxin was still sitting in the pharmacy, waiting to be pulled, waiting to be pushed into a patient's full line by a night nurse who would follow orders because that's what night nurses did. They followed orders. They didn't suggest alternatives. They didn't catch mistakes. At least, that's what Sterling had spent 18 months conditioning the entire unit to believe. Sarah walked to the medication dispensary and verified the order. There it was. Digoxin, 500 mg for, ordered 1,426 hours, not yet dispensed. She pulled the medication sheet and reviewed the pharmacy notes. The pharmacist on day shift, a careful young man named David who'd been at Sacred Heart for 3 years, had flagged the interaction risk in his notes. 3 question marks next to the digoxin. A note, interaction risk with beta blocker. Recommend dose reduction or alternative. Sterling had overridden it. Handwritten override at 1,449 hours. Continue as written. Dr. M. Sterling. The sound of the medication cart rolling past pulled her back to the moment. The night shift stretched ahead, and she had 41 more hours at Sacred Heart before Sterling would arrive tomorrow afternoon to find that his order had been questioned, that his judgment had been scrutinized, that the night nurse, the quiet one, the one who didn't speak unless spoken to, had decided that patient safety outweighed protocol. She would get in trouble for this. She already knew it the way her body knew things, the way her hands knew a tourniquet knot after 6 years of field trauma. Sterling didn't tolerate challenges to his authority. He collected them, filed them away, and used them as ammunition during performance reviews, during budget meetings, during the careful conversations that happened in hospital boardrooms where people decided whose careers got protected and whose got quietly dismantled. But the patient in Bay 4 would wake up tomorrow with a normal heart rate. That was something. That was information that mattered. Sarah pulled the medication sheet down from the board and carried it to the charge nurse station. "I need to call Sterling again," she said to Marcus. "That order needs modification." The next call would be different. This time, she wouldn't ask. Sarah Chen had cleaned up worse messes than this. Much worse. But never in front of 12 resident physicians. Dr. Marcus Sterling's tray clattered across the cafeteria floor at 0613 hours, eggs, toast, coffee, scattered like shrapnel. The residents froze mid-conversation. Sterling stood above Sarah with the posture of a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of dominion, his Italian leather shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights like weapons. "Butterfingers," he said, loud enough for the entire morning shift to hear. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Sarah took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from somewhere deep, from places where she'd learned that oxygen was currency and control was survival. She didn't look up immediately. She looked at his shoes first, noticed the scuff on the left sole, the way he shifted his weight to his right leg, the micro-tell of a man unused to being challenged. Then she raised her eyes to meet his, and held them there while a single tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it fall, let him think for just a moment that he'd succeeded in breaking something, and then she wiped it away with the back of her hand without ever breaking eye contact. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor," she said, voice steady as a surgical laser. "Much worse." The cafeteria didn't go silent. The cafeteria went to the place before sound, the place where molecules stopped moving. One of the residents, a third-year named Chen, no relation, actually took a step backward. Sterling's face flushed in shades of crimson that would have been comical if they weren't so dangerous. He wasn't used to this. He was used to nurses who absorbed insults like sand absorbs water. He was used to the quiet compliance that came from knowing he controlled the schedule, the assignments, the references that would follow you to your next hospital. He was used to winning. "Get back to the unit," he said, turning away from her as if dismissing her were victory. It wasn't. Both of them knew it. "We have rounds in 7 minutes." Sarah stood, collected the scattered dishes into the tray with the efficiency of someone who'd cleaned much worse than broken ceramics, and walked back to the cardiac unit. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She moved like someone who'd learned a long time ago that appearing shaken and actually being shaken were two entirely different things. The unit that morning was understaffed, 2 nurses calling in sick, 1 down for a rotation that Sterling had reassigned as punishment for a minor documentation error. Sarah had been expecting this. Sterling's power moved like weather, predictable if you'd learned to read the patterns. He would marginalize her through workload. He would exhaust her into mistakes. He would build his case methodically, the way a man builds a wall 1 brick at a time, knowing that brick number 400 was indistinguishable from brick number 1. Patient rounds began at 0620. Sterling moved through the unit with the fluid precision of a man who'd perfected the performance of authority. 23 years of cardiothoracic experience, published in the right journals, connected to the right board members. Sarah stood at the foot of each bed, offering observations when asked, staying silent when Sterling's mood made questions dangerous. At bed 4, she spoke anyway. The patient was a 61-year-old male, 3 days post-cab, and his troponin levels had ticked upward since the previous evening. It was subtle, 0.04 to 0.07, but it was movement in the wrong direction. His EKG showed a new T-wave inversion in lead 2. His oxygen saturation was holding steady, but his respiratory rate had climbed from 16 to 22 breaths per minute over the course of 6 hours. "Doctor, his markers are trending up," Sarah said quietly, approaching with the chart. "And the respiratory pattern." "I'm aware of the chart, Nurse Chen," Sterling interrupted, loud enough that the residents paused at the next bed over. "Do you have a medical degree I'm unaware of? Or are you just another floor nurse with a stethoscope and delusions of competence?" One of the residents actually smiled. Not a mean smile, exactly. Just the smile of someone watching the social hierarchy confirm itself. Sarah felt the words land where they were meant to land, in the place that was supposed to make her small. She'd trained herself well enough that no one could see it working. Her face remained as still as water. Her hands didn't shake. But something in her chest tightened, not with fear but with something sharper. Frustration. Recognition. She'd known people like Sterling before. She'd served alongside them, in different uniforms, in different countries. Men who mistook authority for competence, who confused the ability to command with the ability to heal. "Yes, doctor," she said. "I'll continue monitoring." Sterling turned to the residents. "This is what separates us from the support staff. We're trained to see patterns others miss. This patient is fine. Borderline elevated troponin postoperative is expected. The respiratory increase is anxiety-related. He's terrified of being here, not developing cardiogenic shock. Don't let emotional observations cloud your clinical judgment." He glanced back at Sarah with the kind of smile that suggested he'd won something. "Nurse, perhaps a sedative would calm our worried friend here." Sarah nodded and moved to the medication cabinet, her movements economical and precise. As she pulled the midazolam vial, one of the residents, the same third year who'd stepped back in the cafeteria, watched her hands. There was something odd about the way she moved. Not nervous odd. Practiced odd. Like someone who'd done this 10,000 times in 100 different locations, who could find a medication cabinet in pitch darkness if necessary. The resident made a mental note and filed it away, then forgot it almost immediately because his attending was asking him to explain the difference between type A and type B aortic dissections, and that was the kind of question that ended careers if you got it wrong. By 11:47 hours, Sarah had distributed medications, changed 3 sets of dressings, managed a blood draw for a patient phobic of needles with a technique so calm the man barely noticed the needle go in, and absorbed 2 more verbal corrections from Sterling, one about a missing signature on a chart that she'd signed but Sterling had misplaced, and one about her lazy documentation. That was actually her following hospital protocol precisely. The other nurses had noticed. They always did. The way Sterling treated Sarah was becoming theatrical, the performance of a man who needed an audience to feel like he was winning. That was the thing about Dominion, it only worked if people were watching. And then the intercom crackled, "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. The time was 0313 hours. The night shift. The skeleton crew. And the patient coming through the doors was a 28-year-old male with a stab wound to the chest, brought in by fire rescue with a pulse that was already starting to slip. The trauma surgery resident who'd been asleep in the on-call room was just arriving, still buttoning his scrubs. The attending trauma surgeon was 40 minutes away. He'd been in an MVA traffic jam on the 5. Dr. Sterling stood at the entrance to Trauma Bay 4, one hand still holding his coffee cup, and made a decision that would echo through the next 72 hours like a stone dropping into still water. Hold compressions. Hold all procedures. The attending surgeon needs to authorize anything invasive. That's protocol. The trauma resident looked at him. The nurses looked at him. The paramedic still attached to the patient, a man named Rodriguez who'd run 300 calls in San Diego and could read a trauma like others read books, looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested he'd just watched someone make a catastrophic error in judgment. The patient's heart rate was 42 and dropping. His blood pressure was a whisper, 72 systolic, barely sufficient to perfuse a brain. His pupils were blown, his skin the color of wet concrete. His in PEA, the trauma resident said. Pulseless electrical activity. The rhythm between life and death where the heart still fired electrical signals but had lost the ability to squeeze blood through the body. We need to decompress him. Tension pneumothorax, maybe tamponade. Protocol, Sterling repeated, and took a sip of his coffee as if the word settled something. Sarah watched the monitor flatline. Not the electrical activity, that was still there, still firing. But the pressure's dropping. The oxygen saturation collapsing. The patient's eyes, which had held consciousness 30 seconds ago, beginning to dilate. She'd seen this before. Different uniform, different latitude and longitude, but the same mathematics of dying. She'd learned in Ramadi that the space between deciding to save someone and actually saving them was often the space between life and death, and that space shrunk by the second. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved without consulting her conscious mind. She was moving toward the code cart, pulling open the drawer where the spinal needle lived, 18 gauge, 2.5 inches, sharp enough to pierce pericardium but thin enough to thread through the narrow space between ribs. Her hands knew where to find the syringe. They knew the angle, a subxiphoid approach, just below the xiphoid process, aimed up and back toward the right shoulder. They knew the sensation of the needle piercing the fibrous sac around the heart, knew the subtle change in resistance that meant you'd found the fluid. "What are you doing?" Sterling's voice came from somewhere distant, like a radio playing in another room. The hiss of air escaping. That's what she heard. The sound of 50 milliliters of blood, trapped and compressed, finding its way out through the needle and into the syringe. The sound of a heart getting room to beat again. The monitor jumped. 58 to 72 to 88. Sinus rhythm. An actual pulse beneath her fingers on the carotid. But she wasn't there anymore. She was in Ramadi, in a collapsed building with a ceiling that had just stopped being a ceiling and started being rubble, and there was an 8-year-old boy underneath a concrete slab with a femoral artery that was hemorrhaging faster than her hands could work. The antiseptic smell became desert dust. The tile floor beneath her feet became sand that still held the heat of afternoon even as the sun set. The monitor's beeping became the sound of outgoing mortars, so close the shock waves rattled her teeth. She could taste copper and ash. She could feel the boy's pulse under her fingers, fragile as a sparrow's heartbeat, and she knew, the way she knew her own name, that she had exactly 90 seconds to stop the bleeding or watch another kid die because someone had made a bad call, because someone had valued protocol over survival. She blinked. The desert was gone. The trauma bay came back into focus. The patient's oxygen saturation was climbing. 88, 91, 94. The team was moving now, the resident calling out orders, afresh for going in, blood being typed and crossed, the attending surgeon calling from his car, ETA 8 minutes. "What did you just do?" Sterling's voice had changed. It had lost its edge, replaced by something that sounded like the beginning of fear. "Saved his life," Sarah said quietly, and stepped back from the bed so the resident could continue the work. She set the syringe down on the tray. The blood in the chamber caught the fluorescent lights, held it for a moment, and then the moment was gone. The room went dead silent. The monitor showed the story in real time. 92 beats per minute. 88. Then 76. The blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well. James Okoye had arrived at 0313 hours by ambulance, a stab wound to the left anterior chest, the blade having found the space between ribs with the precision of something that knew exactly where to go. His vital signs were already painting a picture that didn't need words, organized chaos becoming disorganized within minutes. Pulseless electrical activity was coming. Sarah could read it in the rhythm like a book written in fluorescent green. "Get Sterling on the phone," she said. It wasn't a question directed at anyone in particular. The resident froze. The attending nurse looked at her. Sarah didn't turn around. She was watching the monitor the way a hunter watches a wounded animal, not with pity, but with the clarity of knowing what came next. "He's 20 minutes out. He said protocol requires him for any surgical intervention. 20 minutes. The number hung in the air between them like a weapon. Sarah felt it the way she'd felt the weight of a rucksack at 0400 hours on a runway in Al Anbar province, felt it the way she felt wind direction and distance. 20 minutes was the gap between living and becoming a body that got photographed for a case review. At this descent rate, 3 beats per minute, maybe 4, they had 8 minutes before the heart stopped organizing itself entirely. The blood pressure was 114/72 now. 86. 62/40. Get me a spinal needle. 25 gauge. And a 10 milliliter syringe. Her voice had dropped. She didn't recognize it at first, that flatten, that narrowness, like something sliding into a channel carved by years of training. Now. Not when Sterling arrives. Now. The resident moved. Someone always moved when you used that tone. That was the thing nobody understood about authority. It wasn't about rank or title or how long you'd been walking a particular floor. It was about the sound of someone who'd already made the decision and was simply announcing it. The monitor flickered. 60/38. The oxygen saturation began its slide, 91, 90, 89. Sarah felt the recognition crystallizing before her conscious mind could catch up. The clinical presentation was textbook. The way his breath sounds had disappeared from the left side when she listened with the stethoscope. The way his neck veins had begun to distend like someone was inflating them from the inside. The sound of his own heart becoming a trap, blood filling the pericardium that surrounded it, compressing, squeezing, turning what should have been a chamber of life into a chamber of suffocation. Cardiac tamponade. Not a guess. Not a suspicion. A diagnosis written in physiology. And then her hands remembered something her mind had tried very hard to forget. The building in Ramadi had been concrete and rebar and the red dust that got into everything. The gunfire was coming from the upper left, perhaps the second floor or the roof. It was hard to tell when the sound bounced off streets that had been empty that morning and were still empty now, just empty in a different way. The child had been under the partial collapse, his arm visible, his fingers opening and closing like he was trying to catch something that was already gone. 8 years old. Maybe 9. The blood was the color of rust. She'd moved through the gunfire the way other people moved through rooms, present but not connected to it, her body conducting business while her eyes stayed on the task. The child was in shock. The femoral artery was exposed. She had 3 minutes before the blood loss became unsurvivable, maybe 4 if she was lucky and if luck was a thing that existed in Ramadi, which it wasn't. She'd applied pressure. She'd applied the tourniquet. She'd gotten him to the aid station and then to the Black Hawk and then to the field hospital where they'd put him back together the way you put something together that was never going to be quite the same. The present moment reasserted itself. The monitor showed 62/28. The resident was placing the needle kit on the sterile field. The attending nurse had moved without being asked to position Okoye supine, had already cleaned the chest wall with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell cutting through the hospital's baseline stew of latex and industrial cleaner. Sarah's hands moved. She didn't feel them move. That was the thing about muscle memory, it operated in the space between thought and action, in the gap where training became something closer to instinct. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle went in at an angle, aiming for the heart, looking for the fluid that shouldn't be there. The syringe was attached. She withdrew. Nothing. That happened sometimes. The first pass was a miss. She adjusted. The needle went deeper. And then, the hiss of blood filling the chamber. 58. 56. 52. She pulled the plunger. The syringe filled with dark red blood that should have been inside the cardiac sac and wasn't anymore. 15 milliliters. She opened a 3-way stopcock. Pushed the blood out into a container. Drew again. 20 milliliters this time. The monitor was still dropping but something in it had changed, a subtle shift in the waveform, a return to something closer to organized. 32 milliliters of blood had been compressing the left ventricle. 32 milliliters stood between life and the alternative. Sinus rhythm returning, someone said. It might have been the resident. It might have been the nurse. The voice felt distant, like it was coming from another room. The monitor climbed. 64. 71. 78. 83. 88. 92. Stable. James Okoye's eyes opened. His pupils were tracking. His hand moved. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the sound almost absurd now that it was unnecessary. The lungs were breathing on their own, the heart was beating on its own. Someone had turned on the overhead lights at some point. Sarah looked down at her hands. The spinal needle was still between her fingers. She placed it on the sterile field with the deliberation of someone setting down a loaded weapon. "Get me a second 4," she said. Her voice was different now. Lower. Type and cross for 4 units of packed red. Activate the massive transfusion protocol. Page cardiothoracic surgery. I want him in the OR within 12 minutes. Not 15. 12. The resident didn't ask why. Nobody did anymore. Sarah could feel the shift in the room, the way the air changed when someone who'd been invisible suddenly became visible. Not visible exactly. Recognizable. The kind of recognition that came from watching someone move through a crisis like water moving through a channel, no hesitation, no second guessing, just the forward momentum of someone whose hands knew exactly what to do because they'd done it before. 1,000 times before. The attending nurse was already calling the OR. The resident was drawing up medications. Sarah checked Okoye's pupils again. Reactive. Equal. That was good. That was the good version of this story. She was reaching for the blood pressure cuff when she noticed the scar on her own forearm, the thin white line that had come from a piece of razor wire in 2005, and something in her chest tightened because she'd spent 2 years trying not to notice things like that. 2 years trying to be the kind of person who didn't notice scars or recognize their own hands moving through muscle memory or remember what it felt like to carry someone else's blood into a place where they were trying to save lives. Senior Chief. It was barely a whisper. She turned. James Okoye's eyes were on her, not fully aware yet, still moving in and out of consciousness the way trauma patients did when the adrenaline was wearing off and the anesthesia was starting to wear on. But his eyes had found her. And his mouth shaped a word. One word. A name. A rank. A call sign from a lifetime she'd buried deep enough that she'd almost convinced herself it had happened to someone else. Valkyrie. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Sarah's hand was on the monitor. She didn't move it. She didn't look away. She did what she'd done 8 months ago in the cafeteria when Dr. Sterling knocked her tray to the floor. She took one measured breath. She held it. She let it go. Above them, the fluorescent lights continued their hum. The monitor continued its beep, steady and organized and alive. In the OR preparation area, someone was calling a surgeon who'd been sleeping and would be pulling on a pair of shoes within 60 seconds because that was what you did when someone said trauma incoming. And in that moment, standing in Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego, Sarah Chen, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, felt the weight of every single thing she'd tried to put down shift just slightly, the way a load shifts in a rucksack when you've been carrying it long enough that your body finally stops fighting it and starts carrying it instead. The next voice she heard came through the intercom. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. False alarm. Just someone monitoring the situation, checking on lives. She reached for the next 4 kit. Her hands were steady. Her hands had always been steady. That was something that 2 years of night shifts and anonymity couldn't change, something that didn't fade just because you stopped wearing the uniform. Her hands remembered. Her hands knew. And now, standing over a patient who'd just spoken her call sign, a patient she'd pulled from a collapsed building 18 years ago, a patient she'd saved at a distance of 200 meters with gunfire painting the air around them, her hands and her mind were having a conversation that everyone else in the room could hear, even if they couldn't quite understand what they were hearing. By morning, the monitors above James Okoye's bed had stabilized into the steady rhythm of survival. Sinus rhythm. 68 beats per minute. O2 sat 94%. The blood she'd evacuated, nearly 400 milliliters of it pooling around his heart like a countdown timer she'd just reset, was already being replaced through the 4 lines at his neck and groin. The pericardiocentesis needle was out. The drain was in. He was alive because she had moved when protocol said stand still. That was when Dr. Marcus Sterling made his first call at 06 for 7 hours. The phone conversation lasted 90 seconds. Sarah heard about it not from Sterling himself but from Janet, the unit secretary, who'd watched him step into his private office with the kind of deliberate calmness that meant he was about to burn something down. By 0900 hours, it was clear what he'd set on fire. Sterling had activated what Sarah would later learn was a network of 3 hospital board members, men who owed him favors stretching back 15 years, men who'd sat in his home during playoff football seasons, men whose kids had been born in rooms he'd cleared for them at a moment's notice. They owed him. And now he was calling that debt due. The second call came at 0924 hours. Sterling, standing in the administrative office with hospital legal counsel, reached the VA clinic in Oceanside where Sarah had worked for 6 months under her middle name, Chen, but also her mother's surname, Morrison, on the employment records. A different person in all the ways that mattered. He asked precise questions about her performance record. Had she ever violated protocol? Had she ever acted outside the scope of her license? Had she ever been flagged for independent procedures without physician authorization? The VA clerk, unprepared for a hospital lawyer asking about a nurse from 2 years ago, began pulling files. Sterling's voice remained smooth as he explained he was conducting a routine reference check for a nursing position. Routine. Standard procedure. No alarm necessary. By 1013 hours, an outside investigator named Richard Halloway had been brought into Sacred Heart through one of Sterling's board connections. Halloway had the look of someone who'd spent 20 years learning how to make people disappear quietly from institutions, grey suit, grey eyes, grey notebook that he filled with meticulous observations. He was tasked with documenting Sarah's reckless endangerment during the emergency procedure. Not to understand what happened. Not to evaluate whether the procedure was medically indicated. Just to document the violation. To build the case. To make it stick. By 12:47 hours, they had everything they needed. Sterling found Sarah at the nurse station during shift change, standing between the medication dispensary and the central monitor where all 4 cardiac unit beds displayed their vital signs like a judgment. The language he used was perfectly calibrated, not angry, not emotional, just institutional. You're suspended effective immediately, pending formal review by the hospital credentialing committee. The investigator will be conducting interviews regarding the unauthorized procedure performed on trauma patient James Okoye at 0313 hours this morning. You will surrender your credentials and badge. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The badge came off her neck in one motion. 24 centimeters of laminated plastic and metal clip, weighing less than 50 grams, the weight of 8 months of night shifts and competence and staying invisible. It landed in Sterling's palm with the precision of someone whose hands had been trained to move without hesitation. The metal felt cold against her fingertips as she released it. Around her, the nursing station went completely still. Every nurse, every resident, every unit secretary watched it happen, the quiet specialist being escorted out, the hierarchy reasserting itself with the efficiency of gravity. You're restricted from the unit until the review is concluded. Effective now. She nodded once. No argument. No defense. Her composure held the way it always held, one measured breath, shoulders level, eyes clear. She'd learned long ago that the only way to survive public execution was to refuse to bleed where they could see it. The walk to her locker took for minutes. 4th floor, employee section, unit 247. The lock opened with her combination, 28, 14, 6, number she'd entered 247 times without thinking. Inside, the accumulated evidence of her careful erasure, 3 pairs of navy scrubs folded precisely, a stethoscope coiled like a sleeping snake, a small pack of facial masks, 1 pair of compression socks. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, the pair of worn combat boots. She pulled them out and held them in both hands. The leather was creased in all the places that meant pressure, impact, running, jumping, moving under fire. The right boot had a dark stain across the inner sole that would never fully wash out, not blood, not anymore, just a ghost of what blood had been 18 years ago in a city where the heat bent the air like glass and buildings fell with a sound like thunder. She stared at them as if they might suddenly explain everything. As if they might suggest what a person was supposed to do when the only life she'd built was an elaborate pretense and the only life she'd known was a thing she'd spent 2 years running from. She packed the boots anyway. Everything else could stay. Everything else was a lie that fit neatly in a 4x3 foot metal box. By 14:56 hours, Sarah was sitting in the waiting room of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in San Diego, filling out an intake form with a pen that didn't write smoothly. The form asked about military service in the section marked Service History and Combat Experience. The box sat there, empty, waiting. She'd left it blank 2 years ago on her first civilian intake forms. She left it blank now. Leaving it blank meant nobody had to file the paperwork. Nobody had to follow up. Nobody had to ask questions about rank or unit or the specific gravity of what someone had seen when they were young and had weapons and were told to move forward. The waiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and old coffee and the particular silence of people who'd learned not to make much noise. Around her sat veterans in various states of wearing their histories, a man with a prosthetic leg scrolling through his phone with the distracted patience of someone who'd learned to wait longer than most people could manage. A woman with a service dog pressing its muzzle against her thigh. An older man staring at nothing, his jaw moving like he was chewing on something bitter. They were the people she used to treat. They were the people she used to be. They were the people she'd decided 2 years ago she couldn't afford to become again. The nurse who called her name was young, probably 26, with the kind of energy that hadn't yet learned what it cost to care about things. She smiled. Sarah didn't smile back. The intake interview proceeded with the clinical efficiency of someone working through a checklist: date of birth, current medications, insurance information, chief complaint. "I need something for the anxiety," Sarah heard herself say. The voice was her own but came from somewhere far away, like she was listening to herself through water. "Something to help me sleep. I'm having trouble with the transition." Transition. As if 2 years of silence, of working nights, of never allowing herself to be in the same room as anyone who'd known her before, constituted a transition. As if you could transition away from the thing that had shaped your hands, your reflexes, your capacity to make decisions in the space between heartbeats. The rain started at 18:47 hours. Not gradually. Not with warning. Just all at once, the way rain sometimes does in San Diego, where it barely ever happens and then happens with complete commitment. It hammered against the waiting room windows with the sound of 1,000 small fists demanding entry. Sarah sat on a bench outside the hospital after her appointment, prescription in her pocket for a benzodiazepine that would do approximately nothing for what she actually carried, rain soaking through her scrubs and into her skin. She'd forgotten her jacket. She didn't go back inside to get it. The parking garage was 7 levels up. Her car was parked in the same spot she'd parked it every shift for 8 months, level 4, space C-47, but getting there meant moving, and movement required a destination, and she couldn't think of one that wouldn't lead her back to the thing she was running from. So instead she sat in the rain. Just Saturday. Her hands were shaking. Not fear. That's what she told herself. Not fear. Something else. The trembling was her body's memory trying to speak a language her mind refused to let it use. The trembling was everything she'd buried for 730 days demanding to be exhumed. She thought about throwing the prescription away. She thought about throwing herself away. She thought about calling her sister in Portland and finally admitting that everything about her life for the past 24 months had been a carefully constructed lie, that she'd walked away from the Navy because Ramadi had broken something inside her that no amount of sleep or medication or night shifts could repair. She thought about the 8-year-old boy's weight in her arms, impossibly light, impossibly heavy. She thought about his name, which she'd never actually spoken aloud in 2 years. The rain kept falling. The cardboard box containing everything from her hospital locker was getting soaked, the boots inside starting to absorb the moisture. She could see the box from where she sat. She'd thrown it in the back seat of her car before she walked out of the hospital parking garage. Now it was getting destroyed. The one thing she should have held onto and protected, and she'd left it in a car being hammered by rain like it didn't matter. Like any of it mattered. She reached into the box and pulled out the boots. They were heavier when they were wet. She held them against her chest the way someone might hold a breathing thing, and something in her throat tried to close, tried to stop the mechanism of breath itself. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. That was the bargain she'd made 2 years ago when she'd signed the paperwork for medical discharge. That was the cost of survival. Soldiers don't cry. Nurses don't tremble. Senior chief petty officers don't sit in parking garages in the rain holding combat boots like they're a rosary that might save them. She held them anyway. And that was when she heard it. First, so distant it might have been her imagination, the distinct double-beat rhythm of a helicopter rotor, the sound of a CH-53K King Stallion cutting through the rain and the darkness. Then closer. Then close enough that the sound made her body sit up straight against every instruction her mind was giving it. The rotor wash began to shake the trees around the parking garage. Then the headlights. Then the convoy. Not emergency vehicles. Not police. Just a line of black SUVs with military bearing, moving through the rain with the kind of purpose that didn't recognize obstacles. She had no idea what was about to happen next. Lieutenant Commander Okoye's eyes opened on the morning of day 3. They moved across the ceiling, across the monitors beeping their steady rhythm, then down to her face. Sarah stood at his bedside checking the fall line, her hand steady on the saline drip. His pupils dilated. Recognition bloomed across his features like sunrise breaking water. His lips moved. One word came out, rough and fractured but unmistakable, Valkyrie. The room contracted around that single syllable. Sarah's hand stilled on the 4. She did not step back. She did not flinch. Instead, she finished adjusting the flow rate with the precision of someone whose muscle memory ran deeper than 8 months of civilian nursing. When she looked at his face again, he was crying. Not from pain. From knowing. The trauma surgeon arrived 40 minutes later with Okoye's chart and personal effects sealed in a hospital bag. She was reading aloud, cataloguing what had come in with him, a naval officer's wallet, a phone with a cracked screen, a photograph of 2 parents standing in front of a small house in Arlington. Then she reached into the bag again and withdrew something that made her voice catch. She held it up to the fluorescent light filtering through the window. Child-sized shoe prints. Preserved in clear resin. Bronze cast. The plaster caught the light like amber holding ancient insects frozen in time. Patient insists, the trauma surgeon read from the file, her voice unsteady, these belong to the medic who saved him in Ramadi, 2005. She looked at Sarah. The other nurses looked at Sarah. The resident looked at Sarah. His parents made this memorial the day after they found him alive in the rubble of a collapsed school. They never knew the medic's name. Just that she was there. That she pulled him out. That she kept him breathing while rounds came in from 3 positions. The silence that followed was the kind that fills spaces between heartbeats. Captain Rodriguez entered through the trauma bay doors like a man who did not ask permission. He wore dress blues with the bearing of someone who'd carried weight no one else could lift. His eyes moved across the room until they found Sarah. Then he stepped forward, and the nurses instinctively parted like water breaking around stone. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, he said, and every word landed like boots on tile. 2 bronze stars with Valor. Navy Commendation Medal for exceptional service under fire. 2 purple hearts. He paused. Let each decoration hang in the air separately, each one its own sentence. Each one a life spent in service of keeping others alive. Medical discharge from Naval Special Warfare Command, 2022, following sustained combat trauma exposure. 3 consecutive rotations in Ramadi, Anbar Province. You were the only combat medic to complete that rotation and survive. Dr. Sterling stood near the window. Sarah watched his face drain of color like someone pulling a plug from a bathtub. The color didn't just fade, it evaporated. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hands began to shake. Actually shake. The same hands that had knocked her tray to the floor, that had tossed a patient chart at her feet, that had wielded institutional power like a weapon for 15 years. Those hands now trembled like leaves in November wind. What the hell is happening? Sterling said, but it wasn't a question. It was the sound of understanding arriving too late. The federal agents came before the question finished landing. Two of them, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who did not negotiate. Their badges caught the light: Department of the Navy, Office of Inspector General. Behind them came Rear Admiral Patricia Vance, Commanding Officer of Naval Medical Command, flanked by the Navy's Judge Advocate General and 3 hospital board members who suddenly looked very small standing next to her. The Admiral's voice carried the weight of institutions built on order and consequence. Dr. Marcus Sterling. Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as Director of the Cardiac Unit at Sacred Heart Hospital for deliberate obstruction of emergency medical care, endangerment of a decorated service member, and violation of federal protocols protecting whistleblower medical personnel. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Authority that absolute does not require volume. Sterling's response came fractured and desperate. He reached for her arm. One of the federal agents moved. Not violently. Just positioned themselves between the Admiral and the man who'd suddenly become very aware that his network of board members and favors meant nothing against the machinery of the United States Navy. I was following protocol, Sterling said, the words tumbling over each other like water down a broken dam. I didn't know, I couldn't have known. You knew, Admiral Vance said. The moment you forbade emergency intervention. The moment you terminated this service member without investigation. You knew exactly what you were doing. The Admiral turned then toward Sarah. She held a small box. Inside, suspended on a ribbon of navy blue and gold, was the Navy and Marine Corps medal. The metal caught the morning light streaming through the window. It was older than Sarah's discharge. Older than the day she chose to walk away from what had broken her. It was from another lifetime, another woman wearing this name. Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen, the Admiral said, on behalf of the United States Navy and the families of the 4,847 civilians whose lives you protected during your service in Anbar Province, I am reinstating this award in recognition of valor above and beyond the call of duty. The Admiral's hands were steady. They had to be, holding that kind of weight. The medal gleamed like a star someone had caught and held in their palm. You chose healing twice. Once on a battlefield under fire. Once in a hospital under siege. That is the definition of service. The Admiral reached forward. The medal hung in the space between them for a single heartbeat. Then Sarah felt the weight settle against her scrubs. The ribbon crossed her shoulder. The metal rested against her heart. It was light. It was heavier than anything she'd carried in 8 months. Across the room, James Okoye, no longer the 8-year-old boy bleeding out in rubble but a Navy officer now, 28 years old and recovering in a hospital bed, raised his hand. His movements were slow, still weak from trauma and surgery. His right arm moved until his fingers touched his brow. A salute. Rendered to the woman who'd saved him twice, once when she'd pulled him from collapsed concrete, and again the moment her hands had stopped the bleeding inside his chest. In his left hand, he held the combat boots. The one Sarah had kept in her locker for 8 months. The ones with dust from a city on the other side of the world still caught in their laces. The ones that had walked through hell and never stopped moving. The room shifted. Nurses who'd watched Sarah submit to humiliation for months now stood witness to this. Residents who'd never questioned Sterling's authority now saw it evaporate like morning mist. The federal agents began moving Sterling toward the doors with the kind of professional dispassion that comes from processing 1,000 men exactly like him. Men who'd believed their institutional position was armor. Men who learned, too late, that armor only protects those with honor underneath. Sarah stood at attention. Her posture straightened like someone had aligned her spine with a ruler. Her voice, when she spoke, had dropped an octave. Thank you, Admiral. Not a question. Not a request. A statement. The voice of someone who no longer needed permission to exist as herself. The federal agents moved Sterling out of the trauma bay and into the corridor. She watched him pass the nursing station where he'd thrown her badge to the floor. Every single nurse, every person he'd dismissed, undermined, or corrected, looked at him as he passed. No one said anything. The silence was more devastating than screams. He was stammering excuses as they escorted him toward the elevators. His career was ending in real time, one step at a time, one set of witnesses at a time. The CPR certification would come later. The community college in Tucson. The name tag that read Steve. The flinch every time someone called him doctor. But that was still coming. For now, there was only the sound of his footsteps echoing down a hallway that no longer belonged to him, and the sound of the federal agents reading him his rights beneath the fluorescent lights that hummed their indifferent song. Admiral Vance turned to the hospital board members. I expect a full review of Dr. Sterling's employment records for the past 5 years. Any other cases where protocol was violated. Any other staff members targeted for retaliation. This institution will implement federal oversight effective immediately. She paused. Let the weight settle. And you will offer Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen the position of Director of Trauma Services. If she accepts. All eyes moved to Sarah. The admirals. The board members. Okoye's from his hospital bed. The nurses at the station who'd watched her move for 8 months with the precision of someone trained for combat and war. Sarah looked at the admiral. Then at her hands. The same hands that had held a child in Ramadi. That had performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without hesitation. That had accepted humiliation and kept moving forward. She thought about the boots. About the choice she'd made to disappear. About the part of her that had died in the rubble of that school and never quite come back to life. I'm honored, Admiral, she said quietly. But I'm going to stay in the field. Night shift. Trauma rotation. Where the need is. Admiral Vance smiled. It was the smile of someone who understood that the greatest warriors don't climb the ladder. They just keep showing up where the bleeding is worst. By that afternoon, Sarah was back in her scrubs. Not because she had to. Because she chose to. She moved through the ward with a precision that had nothing to do with humility anymore. The nurses parted for her not from fear but from recognition. This was someone who'd walked into rooms where people were dying and walked back out with them alive. This was someone who'd carried a secret that could have destroyed a hospital and chose instead to save one more patient. She was checking vitals on a trauma admission in Bay 3 when the new hire, a resident fresh from medical school, approached her with a question about an order. Sarah looked up. The resident's eyes widened slightly, recognizing something in her posture. Something in the way she moved. What's your name? Sarah asked. Dr. Morrison, the resident said. Dr. Morrison, Sarah replied, the protocol for post-operative cardiac monitoring is on the chart. You're looking at it upside down. She said it like still water. Like someone who'd survived worse than mistakes, and kindness was the only answer. You'll get better. Everyone does. The ones who listen to their nurses. The resident nodded. Sarah went back to checking the monitor. The new normal was already settling in place. The hospital would add a Veterans Affairs wing. The board would implement ethics training. The federal oversight would crack down on retaliation. Sacred Heart would become what it should have been all along. But what mattered, in this moment, was that Sarah was back at work. Back where she belonged. Not hiding anymore. Not erased. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of a warrior who'd learned that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding it all together. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us.